afternoon, y'all. I'm going to overview some communication skills that you can use when speaking with landowners. Before working for the Edwards Aquifer Authority, I worked for the Bandera County River Authority and Groundwater District. So hopefully I can provide some perspective from both a large and small groundwater district. I think many of us want to make Texas a great place for everyone. If we can show the public that we care, we can win their support in all aspects of Texas water management. Some of us have never had problems communicating with landowners, and some of us have. Regardless, I hope that you can still learn something. At the very least, I hope you can find some entertainment in hearing about my failures and the lessons that I have learned. Because no matter where you are in your career, you can never be too good at communicating. Good communication doesn't just affect our immediate interactions. It can have far-reaching effects, and we can help inspire landowners to improve their property and make their piece of Texas just a little bit better. We can accomplish so much more as scientists and regulators when we build effective partnerships. If you need to access a research area, inspect a feature, collect some data, or document easement conditions, you're probably going to have to go out onto private property. This is why good landowner relationships are so essential to our research, fieldwork, and successful careers. The first thing to remember when talking with landowners is that they know their land. Many families pass down stories about water on their land through the generations, and there's so much that we can learn about the history of water in Texas through these stories. Most landowners are advocates of improving their property because they usually have quite a bit of money and time invested into it. So the main thing to emphasize when you talk with the landowner is that you have their best interests in mind. If you can base your communication with them around that, you'll probably have a positive outcome. The work a groundwater district does is usually beneficial to landowners. It's also important to tell landowners what your district is doing and why it's doing it. Because if they can understand the reasons behind what we do, they're so much more likely to want to participate in that process. Because people don't care about things that they don't understand. The Edwards Aquifer Authority has found that conservation easements are a proactive and incentive-based approach to land management. These partnerships with landowners have allowed us to conserve many acres of land across the region. Many of you are probably familiar with conservation easements, but if you aren't, it's a formal agreement between a landowner and a regulatory agency. It helps prevent future development and preserves historical recharge on that property. However, these easements are only successful when both the regulator and the landowner uphold their side of that agreement. So the relationship between the easement monitoring team and that landowner is essential to maintaining that protective value. We always want landowners to know that they are our partners and collaborators, so we work hard to develop and incorporate collaborative data sharing methods. This helps us further aquifer research and improve the relationships with those landowners. We want to include them every step of the way to make sure that their needs and ours are met. Before I share some anecdotes with you, I want to provide some perspective. It's important to remember that not everyone knows what you know, and not everyone thinks the way you think. You may see something cool on somebody else's land, and you walk over to check it out. The landowner could view this as you being intrusive. Inspecting someone's well might make the landowner feel that you're imposing excessive regulations on them. You may drive up to a property trying to figure out if you're at the right property, and the landowner could see this as you trying to break in. This has actually happened to me, but I'll get to that later. The most important thing to remember is that you always call ahead before going out to a property. If you have gotten permission in the past to go out to that property, call ahead, no matter what. If you can't get a hold of them and you have gotten permission in the past, go ahead and call them before you head out to the property, and then call them when you get there if you do have to get to that property that particular day. Leave them a voicemail and just let them know who you are and what you're planning to do out there. This experience taught me the hard way why you always call ahead. A coworker and I were measuring a monitor well level on a private property. We had gone out to measure this water level for years. We had never met the landowner. The landowner had made this agreement with a previous employee way back when. The landowner happened to be on site that day, and he watched us drive across his property over to his monitor well. So he walked over to our truck and leaned in the window and asked why we hadn't contacted him in advance. He threatened to withdraw from our monitor well program. We stayed in the truck because he was pretty agitated, and frankly, he had every right to be upset. We were attentive, we acknowledged the problem, we apologized for not contacting him in advance, and we promised to always do so in the future. Once he felt safe with his property rights, we were able to refocus that conversation, and he started asking us questions about the aquifer. Ultimately, we were able to keep our monitor well, and I learned a very valuable lesson. When you make a call to a landowner, try to get as much information as possible into as few words as possible. You want to stick with these 4 main talking points. Let them know who you are, what you're doing, why you're going to do it, and when you're planning to do it. Some people also want to be out on site with you, and some people don't. So try to accommodate their preference on that. Misunderstandings are really common in phone calls. You might have poor reception, there could be background noise, or you or they could be difficult to understand over the phone. I always try to repeat important statements 2 or even 3 times during a phone call just to make sure that I am not misheard. And if I'm not completely sure about something, I'll ask someone else and get back with that landowner with the correct answer. It can also be helpful to bring that landowner in if they still have questions and have an in-person meeting. If a conversation starts going downhill on the phone, these are some specific skills that we can refer to as good customer service. And I have seen these used effectively many times in bringing a negative communication to a peaceful conclusion. When you're on the phone, it's important to control your emotions. You want to stay calm, be kind, and bring a coworker into the room if you need to, just for emotional support. Don't argue with the landowner. Try to avoid interrupting them. Make sure they know that you're listening to them. It's also important to remember that you don't always need to offer a solution to solve a problem. Sometimes people just need to vent. It's important to acknowledge the landowner, acknowledge their feelings, and acknowledge what they're saying. You can ask them, how can I help? I'm very sorry this happened. And if you made a mistake, you could say, I apologize that I was not clear about this. And finally, take a mental break if you need it. It's okay to get back with someone later, and it's also okay to refer someone to a supervisor, as long as you've cleared it with that supervisor beforehand. Sometimes it's best to just end that conversation as politely as possible. Personally, I have been on a phone call where the conversation just wasn't going well. I was being verbally attacked over and over, and there was nothing more that I could do at the time to solve the issue. So I told the person on the phone that I would have a supervisor contact them, and then I ended that call. Luckily, this hasn't happened to me since then, and hopefully it won't happen to you either, but it's best to be prepared. First impressions are always important when talking or working with landowners. Again, no matter how many times you've been out to that property, always call ahead. Try to arrange a meeting time around their schedule, and listen carefully to what they're saying, especially if they tell you instructions about how to get to their property or to a certain feature or well on their property. It's also best to avoid technical jargon unless that landowner is in a technical field. Then they might appreciate the jargon, so use your best judgment on that. In person, always make sure you're at the right property before you get to that property. Check out Google Maps. They have a 3D viewer that you can use. You can zoom in and you can look at the gate just to make sure you know exactly where you're headed. Try to read the landowner's body language, make them feel at ease, and always follow the road most traveled. Try to avoid forging your own path on their property if you can, because you may run over a valuable plant or one of those highly revered, very long mesquite thorns. And unless the landowner has told you otherwise, always close the gate behind you. In person, many of these skills are the same, but you also want to consider your personal safety. Use your best judgment regarding situations. Bring a buddy out to the field, and always listen to what the landowner is saying and follow their directions. It's important to pay attention to your body language. Try to relax your shoulders. Try not to stare them down. Try to have soft eye contact. Give them your attention, and give them some personal space. You also want to acknowledge them, remain respectful, acknowledge if they're feeling frustrated about something, and always keep your promises. It's helpful to write those down because it's really easy to forget. It can also be helpful to refocus a situation. Listen to grievances and offer them contact information and help or resources. The reason I didn't put this skill in the phone skills slide is because when someone is upset, they can often get hyper-focused on an issue and be more emotional than they would be in person. I think we can all relate to this. It's much easier to be upset with somebody if you can't see their face. So this can make it more difficult to refocus that situation. Hopefully, you never have to get to the last resort option. I have personally never found this to be necessary, but that doesn't mean that it's not ever going to happen. It's really important that everyone feels safe and comfortable in the field. So use your best judgment to decide when it's time to just leave that property. This story is a great example of how landowners can misunderstand your field work. I knew some coworkers who were going out to do a monitor well level on a private monitor well. A geologist happened to be with them. And I don't know if any of you know a geologist, but geologists tend to like to look at rocks. And this particular geologist was admiring the rocks on the ground, about 30 feet away from the well. However, this landowner's neighbor was watching them through the window with a pair of binoculars. And the neighbor called the landowner and told this landowner that they were snooping on her property. So the landowner called us and threatened to withdraw from the monitor well program. One of the employees that was with the geologist spoke to the landowner. He controlled his emotions. He didn't argue with her. He apologized for the misunderstanding. And he explained that she was just a geologist admiring the rocks, as many of us do. He acknowledged her concerns. And once she felt comfortable with her privacy and property rights, the conversation was refocused, and she started asking questions about rocks on her property. Ultimately, if somebody perceives something, it's very hard to influence that perspective later on. So it's best to avoid looking like you're doing anything other than what you planned to do on that property. This is a lesson that I learned about why you always need to make sure that you're at the right gate before you get to a property. My coworkers and I were going to do a post-drill inspection on a well. We drove up to a gate that was maybe 100 feet away from another gate on the same road. We tried our gate code that we had, and it wasn't working. So we entered it a few more times, and it still didn't work. So we figured it was probably that other gate. And sure enough, the gate code worked on the other gate. So we entered that property, and as we were driving in, the landowners at the first property had been watching us attempt to open their gate. They drove over to the fence neighboring that property, and they motioned us over. We drove the truck to the fence and rolled down the window, and they demanded to know why we were trying to break in to their property and wanted to know why we were on their neighbor's property. We stayed in the truck because they were pretty agitated, but we were attentive. We acknowledged their concerns. We explained that our GPS showed us that the well was right behind their gate and it had made a mistake. Eventually, we were able to refocus the conversation, and they started talking about an unrelated incident on the property. We gave them our business card, and we were able to go on our way. So again, everything is about perspective. Just to review, these are a few general communication tips. Use a respectful title, provide your contact information, and always respect their time. Offer access to any data that you collect out in the field, and speak clearly and repeat important statements. If you can't answer their question, try to avoid telling them that you just don't know. Try to give them resources or connect them with somebody who can help them. And finally, it's always better to over-communicate than under-communicate. So just make sure you respond to any emails and phone calls within a day or two. And if that landowner asks a specific question and you can't answer it within that time frame, go ahead and send them a message, just letting them know that you've seen that message and that you'll get back to them as soon as you can. The most important thing to remember is that you should always act like you have an audience in the field, because you can't control how others act, but you can control how you act. The second most important thing is that it's okay to make mistakes. We wouldn't learn anything if we didn't. Just be willing to own up to them and try to learn from them when they happen. As you can see, you can find some pretty good helpers when you use good communication. So my career is in science, not communications. But if you would like to learn from some expert communicators, these are 3 great books that I have read over the last year that they have significantly influenced the way that I view communication. I would recommend these to anybody in any field. Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.